Well, good morning, everyone. It is a gorgeous day here in London, loads of sunshine. We've clocked over our 100 days of lockdown here in London this week. So we're still here. We're still coping as best we can. And really excited to bring you this episode, episode 7 of our Scaling So Far series. We've gone international. We've gone outside of Europe. We'll get to that in just a second. But before we get stuck in, a bit of the usual housekeeping that we do. Obviously, we're recording this episode today. It'll be added to our website and shared with you in email. So don't worry if you need to drop off and go and feed the dog or go and fill up the coffee at any point in time. You'll be able to hear it back. You can also ask questions at any time. You've got the chat function there. So feel free to chat to us at any point during this morning's episode. Without any further ado, though, today's guest has an absolute wealth of knowledge and experience, so much so, in fact, that she's written a book. This is our first author to join us on the Scaling So Far series. So I'm sure she's going to have plenty to share, all the way from, I would say, sunny Singapore, but my memories of it are that it's incredibly humid Singapore as well. I'm delighted to introduce Caron. She's an international speaker, author, and consultant, drawing on 10 years' experience as a senior HR executive at Google. She set up her own consulting practice back in 2015 to support founders building high-performing and positive organizations, primarily in APAC, but also over here in Europe. She's since developed a methodology for startups to grow the right organization and team, which she describes in her new book, which will tell you all about how you can get that later on, From 0 to 1,000, the organizational playbook for startups. There you go. That's some introduction, Anne. How are you feeling?
Ooh, good. Super happy to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation, and to be somehow a little bit in Europe, because from where I am, Europe is going to be quite far for a long time. It doesn't feel like the frontiers are going to open anytime soon. So happy to be there a little bit. Thanks to you.
Happy to be talking to an Australian who is also stuck in Europe, no doubt.
Anyway,
we're sort of switching hemispheres, you and I, at the moment. But, anyway, Anne, you founded your consultancy, Caron Consultancy, and recently launched your book. What led to that? What was the kind of moment that made you decide to go out on your own and then to write all about it as well?
So what made me go on my own? Frankly, I wish I was able to tell you, well, that was courage. I knew it from the beginning. I'm an entrepreneur. That's not really the case. It just happened. So I was 10 years at Google. And I started in 2005 out of Paris. And at the time at Google, we were 5,000 people. Globally, in Europe, it was only 1,500 people, and people didn't quite know about Google as an employer. I mean, everybody knew the search engine, obviously, but as an employer, people didn't know that you could work there, what type of job there was. And so that was really exciting because there was so much to build, so much to do on the sourcing front, on the entrepreneur and the employer brand side. So that was really exciting, and I loved this part of my time there. I'm a builder. I love solving problems, and when I see a gap, I like to fill it. And so that was really cool. And I remember that as Europe was growing, I was already starting that it was getting too big. So that's how I went to APAC. I was like, let's get somebody somewhere smaller where we can do more stuff. But when I left it, we were, so 2015, the company was 65,000 employees by then. And if in 2005 we're struggling to have people to apply to our jobs, it was 3 million applications that we were reviewing per year. So all of a sudden, what we were doing was not so much building, but was a lot of optimizing, and that was a lot of the things that I was doing, which got me into really interesting projects. But I also on one hand felt a nostalgic of the early days when I could really almost start from scratch, and also a bit of frustration that change was very difficult to bring. And that even in a company like Google, when it comes to organization and people strategy, people managing performance, for instance, there was not much innovation anymore that we were able to bring. If you look at the performance management system, it's very much the same as what you would find in any other company. And I was like, we can do better. There has to be a better way. People, everybody's hating the performance reviews. So why are we?
I remember that quite great when I was there.
That's just So and I tried. It's just impossible because I was in tiny office Singapore, and plus you don't change things that easily in such a big organization, even at Google. So yeah, so that's how I kind of said, okay, let's go outside and have a look at what I can do, and I ended up looking at the entrepreneurship ecosystem, and found it super interesting. And there was a gap here on the people side and the organization side. And that's how I got started with my consulting. So I started with a lot of consulting on talent acquisition. Obviously, I mean that's the first pain point that founders come to you for. It's like, oh, I need to hire. How do I do? And then it's like, oh, by the way, I have all these people now. Oh, what do I do with them?
How do I keep them?
Yeah, how do I keep them? But even how do I keep them engaged? How do I know if they perform? The whole thing in the organization. So yes, that's how I started my consulting for the book. It actually started. The idea started 2 years ago. I had a client at Series B that I just started with them, and they had no HR, no recruiting, nothing. There were 75 people, and for them, it was quite clear that they were going to remain lean. We're a startup, we're going to stay lean. And after a few interviews with the business, I figured out that there were 150 open roles that the managers were already hiring themselves.
Wow.
And I was like, oh my God. I mean, how do we manage that? And so it was really crisis mode, frankly. Even with all the methodology I had put in place, all the knowledge that I knew, it was just super complicated because it was panic mode. There was no hiring capability, so all the managers had no idea the hiring bar. Were just hiring whatever they could find. The employee experience was terrible. I had the case of one candidate being hired from the UK to Singapore, being offered, he had resigned and let go his apartment, and then the manager just calls like, yeah, actually, we don't think you're quite a fit, and that was it. And I was like, what? I mean, how is that possible? There was no HR capability, so some employees didn't even have contracts. Some people were working without working permits as well. So a lot of different things. Management capability was not here, so some employees didn't have managers. They didn't even know which team they belonged to. They kept being pulled in one direction and then to the other. So it was very, very complicated. And what I realized was that actually the founders had no time at all to speak with me and to think about all this. And it actually had to happen way earlier. And when Series B is actually the moment when you feel the pain of the organization, it's almost too late to build it, because it takes time and it takes thinking. So that was kind of the step back that I did. I started to do much more work early stage to do founder advisory, to basically tell them this is what you have to be thinking about right now. So mostly around the company culture. And it's mostly about thinking and planning, not so much about doing, building complex things.
Yeah, being ready.
Systems, yes. So that's how I built. I created that book. It was like really and I intend to educate founders on the necessity to think about that as early stage as possible, and then to know what's the roadmap. When do I start to hire my first HR, and what type of profile do I need? When do I need to get an internal recruiter? When do I need blah blah blah? You know, all this type of stuff.
And is there a chapter in the book or a particular piece of advice that you think is particularly important for people to know?
So the way the book is organized is the first part is very much about what's coming ahead. So you're a founder, you're hopefully you got the book as you know, and you're still at the beginning of the race. And this is what's coming ahead. So these are the different phases of a startup, and you as a founder as well, you need to know that your role is going to change. You're going to be a jack of all trades to start with, but very quickly you'll have to move to a manager, because when you have 10 plus people, they do need to be managed to feel that somebody is here, and then you need to move to a leader. So to me, perhaps the first chapter or the first part of the book is the most important, because that's what I hope creates a click. And it's like, oh yeah, I didn't realize that I was getting into that. You know, it seems fun for the first mile, but it lasts quite long.
A lot of people think, a lot of founders that I've interacted with recently, and even people that I've met as part of like interview processes, they think they're creating a product and it's all about the consumer or the buyer and you know, the innovation of the product and the product roadmap, etc. And it's like, you know, you've got to bring some people along for the ride in order for you to be able to do that, and you've got to kind of look after those people as well, or else you're not going to have a product, you're not going to have a consumer. So it's really interesting that you say that some of the founders just don't even sort of think about that part of the process when they're starting out.
But it's actually for a number of different reasons. The first is because there's not a function that is dedicated to that apart from HR. And HR has been for a long time seen as an operational and administrative function. At least for the small companies. So it's not something, you know, you're not going to get your HR manager sitting at the leadership table and being able to challenge you and say, hey, have you thought about that, or what about this? So that's one. And the second is they don't really realize the business plan looks all good, but it's only a piece of paper until you have people who can actually execute it. And that's, I always talk about conversations with the founders this way. It's like, I agree. I mean, everything that you told me sounds great. But there's a number of things that you need to be successful in your entrepreneurship journey. You need a great product for sure. I mean, you need, you know, people being interested in what you do. You need to have a revenue model so that you generate some revenues out of that. You need to have some capital so that you can scale. But you need also an organization, and a scalable organization. And most founders just focus on the first three. The fourth one is totally forgotten about and usually delegated to HR, which are poor things most of the time, quite junior, and you know, can't really handle that.
Often incredibly junior as well in those early stages. So that's the key piece of advice that you think people should take away. What do you think is the biggest heap of BS advice that you've heard when it comes to scaling teams?
So I think what I'm seeing a lot is that founders tend to build things, or HR actually, without even knowing why they're doing it. It's most of the time because, well, that's the way it's being done in my previous company, and so you end up having,
or even worse, because that's the way Google do it, which is what a lot of people say as well.
Absolutely. So yeah, that's just like, so of course I loved, I mean, Google was absolutely fantastic as an experience for me, and I learned so much. But I was actually really scared when I started to work with startups, how much they were looking up to Google and how many were implementing OKRs with 10 employees. And it was like, why? I mean, OKRs are not going to help you in any way. It's going to confuse most of more than anything else. So yeah, performance management system. In my book, I actually put it in this order. So first, you need to nail your company culture. Just know who you are, what is it that you want to do, and how do you want to do it? What are your key principles? Then you can build some capabilities, and after that, you have the performance management framework. But a lot of founders start with, when they engage with me, it's like, oh, no, the most urgent is going to be the performance. Yeah, but how do I build it? I don't even know who you are and what fits you.
What are we measuring
don't know
against?
that either. And so, yeah, no, it's and often it's like, do you have a problem with performance? And the main advice is, don't build anything unless it's solving a problem, because the risk of building it is that it may create more problems because you're making it more complex, more complicated for everyone, and it may add more complexity. So usually processes goes this way. It's like a process is either to validate a practice that is working well, and we're forcing Scale, so we're just putting it in writing so that we have consistency and we gain in efficiency. Or it's indeed bringing a change, but the change has to be motivated by something. You need to, to know that you're asking people to invest time and effort to change the way they're doing for a reason.
Not just for the sake of changing a process every 2 years, like a lot of really, really big companies might do, just to, oh, we haven't changed that for a couple of years. Let's, redo our organizational structure. Why not? We've spoken on this series recently, Anne, quite a lot about inclusive hiring. It's obviously a massive focus. It's Pride Month, and no doubt we're all seeing what's going on in the news all around the world at the moment with the Black Lives Matter protests and the sort of knock-on effects of that Indigenous Lives Matter, etc. Movement that's certainly happening back in Australia, where I'm from, and even in the US and New Zealand. What lessons, what guidance do you give to these, really sort of early stage companies that are maybe not even thinking about inclusive hiring or don't prioritize inclusive hiring? What sorts of advice or guidance do you give to them at this stage?
So very early stage is complicated because first you might not really see a lack of inclusiveness. You might foresee that it will come, but it's difficult to actually identify it. And also they don't have the luxury to think about that. And so the luxury and the knowledge, but the knowledge about themselves. Coming from Google and having spent quite some time in talent acquisition, I was always, one of the key principles I had is that you're better off with no one than the wrong person. Just don't hire unless you know that's the best of what on the market. And I was a headhunter also before, so I know the idea of get the best or just don't get, or find another option, which is part-time or whatever. But in very early stage, it's very difficult to do because they don't know what they don't know. They don't necessarily know what they need, and so what works well, and where I had to pivot myself, and be okay, yeah, perhaps that doesn't fit here, is to be doing trial and error. And so you hire fast, you fire fast, and you gain learnings much quicker this way, while still being, a good human being. Obviously, that goes without saying.
Treating people with respect. I mean, you can manage performance and ultimately let go of somebody in an incredibly honest, open way that in some ways will leave them better off afterwards, because they'll know that job wasn't right for them for these reasons, so they'll go off and find something else that is more appropriate. So yeah.
So I mean, those are constraints for being inclusive. Now, what is important again is awareness and consciousness
Mm-hmm.
on what is necessary. Why inclusiveness is important for the business. It's not because you want to be nice and it looks nice to be. No, it has a
And
business
it's trendy.
implications. It's trendy. Yay! Let's be cool. But yeah, there are business implications, and also you get into it, you know, being uninclusive before you realize it. And as a founder, the mainstream and channel of hiring is your network. And so, you know, Indian founders would have mostly Indian team members. French founders would have mostly French founders. Corporate founders would have mostly corporate employees, etc. So, and that's natural. That's kind of okay at the beginning, but you need to realize that that's not, you know. And the same goes with, you know, gender diversity, of course. I mean, evolving in a startup environment is, you know, startup environment is male dominated anyways. And on top of that, tech is, you know, even worse. One good thing as well is to encourage on different initiatives on different fronts. I'm involved in initiatives to try to bring more female investors or diverse investors.
Investors, yeah.
Because the investors will also play a huge role in how, you know, you shape your strategy around hiring, and even the investment. I mean, we already have very little female founders. If I take that, you know, that group, and we have seen that the female founders are mostly invested in by female investors.
Yep.
Because male not necessarily, you know, are not necessarily attracted by, you know, fashion, if we want to be, you know, caricaturing, but like fashion thing. And sometimes female are solving female problems. There are a lot of really interesting startups on that front. And if you go to male investors to say, yeah, I'm in India and I created that app for female who have problems with their period.
Yeah, you could probably hear a pin drop in the room.
Yeah, so yeah, so surrounding yourself with that's investors, but also mentors, advisors, kind of coaches, and bring a different, you know, perspective on things.
Cool. And we've had a question from the audience, and if I've correctly recognized the individual, I think it's Valentina. Well, I know it's Valentina, but I think it's Valentina from Glovo in Barcelona. Potentially, in which case, great to have you back on again. I know you've joined us a couple of times already. If not, welcome to a new Valentina, and my apologies for misnaming you. She asked, speaking of company culture and a flat structure in a startup, how do you build it and how do you make sure it doesn't turn into too flexible a democracy? So creating that company culture in a really flat structure in a startup, how do you build it? But how do you make sure it doesn't become too flexible or too inclusive of everybody's input in a democratic way?
Well, so that's taking into the assumption that a company culture is a flexible, inclusive culture. And I often have the questions of founders of like, oh, do you think my culture is good? Or, well, what is a good culture? And I don't think there's good or bad culture. There's a good or bad way of defining your culture. There are, of course, culture that are, you know, insane. So that's a different category. But at the end of the day, not everybody is a fit for Google. Not that Google would not hire you, but you wouldn't be happy at Google or Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn. And there are millions of people who apply to banks every day. So there are people who want more organized, structured and a working environment, and who just want to be told what, you know, this is my scope of work, and I'm going to do that from 9 to 6, and I'm happy with that. So we need to recognize that culture is anything. Now, the good way of defining a culture is for founders to be thinking about it and to be self-aware about who they are. 80% of the culture is comes from the founders, and if not the founders, the CEO. If the CEO is not a founder, and so the first exercise is to be extremely honest about who you are as a founder. I've seen a lot, especially I've been working mostly with companies in Asia. And so they look up to the Google, the Facebook, the LinkedIn's, and they have free food, bean bags, and OKRs, yeah, of course. And it's like kind of okay, we've ticked that box. We're a good culture, but the thing is that culturally speaking, even the young generation, they're very top down in their way of functioning. And so if you put in your values that you empower people, and then in your policies, you have something that requires them to be at work from 9 to 6, or that's, or that the OKRs, and that's a lot of what I'm saying, are actually a cascade of objectives that the employees have no choice in defining. People are going to see that there's a discrepancy, so they will trust what they see, what they experience. And so when you say we are empowering, they won't believe you, or the word itself will not resonate. And so you're kind of lying to your candidates. You're not. So the most important is to know who you are. If you're regularly late at meetings, don't put punctuality in your values, because it won't work. And so once you have done this work properly, and so you have designed your HR policies in sync with your values and your HR, your all processes, always stress testing them with, does that fit with our values? Then the values don't need almost to be communicated that often, because they are already experienced on a regular basis within the organization. People. And the stress test for me is I go to the employees and I say, okay, these are the values. What do you think? And either they roll up their eyes like, oh yeah, on paper, you wish. Or they're like, yeah. And sometimes they don't even know it's been written somewhere. And they're like, and they're able to immediately connect concrete examples to specific values.
I think obviously, and you and I both worked together in Paris, and you're from there, and I lived there for a very long time. And you're talking about it in the context of Asia, and the fact that, in Asia Pacific, people are trying to replicate this, Californian, because a lot of those cultures that we know, Netflix, Google, Apple, etc., they originated in Northern California, the majority of them, which is a very particular talent pool, a very particular kind of educational system, etc. To even replicate that in France was really clunky and really awkward. We're going to be cool and we're going to be all this and have all the free food and everything. And when you have free food and people want to take 2 hours off for lunch and every day, it becomes almost paradoxical, because people don't necessarily want to all sit in the canteen together and have free food. They want to go to the local cafe and meet up. So even in what might seem like much more similar cultures, taking into consideration who you are, where you're from, and what's important to you is so important when you're thinking about how you're going to define your culture. I can confirm it was Valentina from Glovo who asked that question. So thank you for joining us again. And we do need to close up now, because we've hit our time, but I want to make sure that everybody knows how to get a hold of your book. So the ebook is already available on Amazon. How from 0 to 1,000, how to scale positively, and it will be available in the written version. If you're like me and you actually like to hold a paper thing in your hand when you read a book, it will be available on the 25th of July worldwide, also on Amazon. So I want to say thank you to you, Anne. It's afternoon in Singapore, and I know that you've probably got life commitments that you need to get back to, and the rest of us will be finishing our coffee and getting back to work. But next week, our founder, Matt, will be back with Truth Reveal, continuing in our theme of France. because he's the global sourcing leader, Dr. Lid, which is one of many very successful, one of few, sorry, very successful health tech startups that's come out of France and come out of Paris. So he'll be telling us his story, talking about his experiences previously at Lyst and Indeed.com. So for those of you who join us next Thursday, we'll see you then. And once again, thank you very much, Anne, for joining us from Singapore. And I'm really pleased to hear about the book, and look forward to reading it myself, and when the paper version comes out. And hopefully one day when we can all move around again, we'll see you soon back here in Europe, or I'll see you over there. Take care. It's been great.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Cheers, Anne. Bye-bye.